Not all milk is what it looks like. Some UK brands come from crowded farms, endless processing, and far from fresh fields. Here's the truth about the worst milk brands you should skip. Walk down any Tesco aisle and you'll spot it immediately. 2 litres for under £1. Sounds brilliant until you start asking questions about where this milk comes from and what happens before it lands on that shelf. The cows producing this stuff spend their days packed into massive indoor facilities, never getting close to an actual field. Their meals consist almost entirely of grain because grass doesn't fit the production schedule. Nobody running these operations cares whether the animals ever see daylight. When your only job is pumping out volume, corners get cut everywhere. Processing strips away whatever's left. They blast it with ultra-high temperatures, homogenize it within an inch of its life, and throw in extra treatments just to keep it stable during transport. What you end up with barely resembles what milk should taste like. Proteins get damaged, natural sweetness vanishes, and that rich flavor you're expecting never shows up. Drop some in your tea and watch it separate or taste faintly metallic, which tells you everything about how far this product has strayed from anything natural. Blending milk from dozens of different farms means consistency over character, logistics over livestock care. Each bottle represents a system where affordability trumps absolutely everything else. And you taste that compromise in every sip. The milk itself isn't dangerous, but understanding what you're actually buying matters more than most people realize. Think about the journey next time you pour. Crowded barns, industrial machinery, long supply chains, and finally, your fridge. What lands in your glass carries the weight of every shortcut taken along the way, prioritizing price tags instead of quality or flavor or anything resembling traditional dairy farming. That bargain price comes at a bigger cost than you might expect, and not every milk with a familiar label is any better. Everyone recognizes Müller. The branding screams premium quality, the bottles look expensive, and shoppers assume they're getting something special. Except that familiar name doesn't guarantee what you think it does, because once you dig beneath the surface, the real story starts looking surprisingly industrial. Thousands of farms across Britain feed into Müller's supply chain, all their milk getting mixed together in enormous tanks long before bottling begins. By the time you crack open that cap, every individual cow's story has been erased. What they ate, where they lived, how they were treated, all gone, blended into one indistinguishable product that only looks uniform. Those farms follow standard industrial practices. Cows kept indoors year-round, fed grain-based diets designed for maximum output rather than natural health, pushed constantly to produce more while their quality of life becomes an afterthought. The milk reflects these choices immediately. Thinner consistency, flatter taste, missing the richness that comes from animals actually grazing on proper pasture instead of standing on concrete floors. Some suppliers have even started experimenting with feed additives, not because it improves anything for consumers, but because it helps manage the stress of keeping thousands of cows confined indoors. The label won't mention any of this, and why would it? Müller markets itself as premium while operating within the exact same network that produces the cheapest supermarket milk you can buy. Despite the fancy packaging, what you're drinking traveled through massive blending facilities and processing plants before reaching your refrigerator. That creaminess you taste comes from machinery and careful engineering, not from happy cows wandering through green fields. Müller might carry a trusted reputation, but your glass contains the output of industrial-scale production, nothing more. Even trusted names can hide the same industrial story. Sometimes the packaging is the only thing that looks premium. Grab that sleek Cravendale bottle, and you're holding something that markets itself as practically perfect, pure, creamy, and premium in every way. The packaging certainly suggests quality, but what's actually inside tells a different story once you know where to look. Large-scale operations supply Cravendale, places where cows rarely step foot outside, and grass becomes an afterthought in favor of grain-heavy feeding schedules. The whole setup prioritizes predictability over natural farming, keeping milk stable on shelves and maintaining that consistent brand image shoppers expect. Filtering removes bacteria along with most of the flavor complexity, natural fats, and subtle characteristics that develop when cows live outdoors eating what they're supposed to eat. Pour it over your cereal or into your coffee, and sure, it feels creamy enough. But that texture comes from processing techniques rather than quality ingredients or proper animal husbandry. The depth you'd find in genuinely grass-fed milk simply isn't there anymore. Engineered out in favor of uniformity, so every bottle tastes identical whether you buy it today or 3 weeks from now. Your carton traveled significant distances, combined milk from multiple sources, and underwent treatments specifically designed to extend shelf life far beyond what fresh milk naturally achieves. Stable, standardized, predictable. Absolutely. Rich, flavorful, anything like traditional dairy, not even close. You're paying extra for branding and convenience, while the actual milk quality lags behind what the marketing promises. Cravendale represents everything modern industrial dairy has become. Shelf life matters more than taste, consistency beats character, and convenience outweighs connection to where food comes from. Drinking it won't hurt you, but recognizing what you're really getting changes how you see that supposedly premium product sitting in your fridge. Because every sip carries traces of the industrial system that produced it, rather than the individual cow that made it possible. Creamy on the outside, but far from what you'd expect inside, and affordability doesn't always mean quality. Cheap, simple, practical. Sainsbury's Basic Milk looks like the obvious choice when you're watching your budget. Most people grab it without thinking twice, assuming milk is milk and saving money makes sense. But that low price comes attached to a production system built entirely around efficiency rather than delivering actual quality or flavor. Indoor farms supply most of this milk, massive operations where cows spend their whole lives essentially inside buildings, rarely seeing fields, and definitely not grazing on grass the way people imagine when they picture dairy farming. Their diet leans heavily on grain because it's cheaper and easier to control. And these aren't small family herds. They're part of sprawling industrial networks designed to churn out maximum volume at minimal cost. Milk that doesn't meet premium standards often gets funneled straight into basics, meaning this is a truly bottom-tier product. The difference shows up immediately when you use it. Sure, it pours like milk, but it's noticeably thinner, paler, lacking that natural creaminess you'd expect from cows eating fresh grass and living normal lives. The depth and richness just aren't there, replaced by something that technically qualifies as milk, while missing most of what makes good milk enjoyable. Keeping this stuff stable requires aggressive processing, intense heat treatment, heavy homogenization, and preparation for long-distance shipping. These steps destroy delicate proteins and beneficial bacteria, which explains why it often separates in hot beverages or tastes slightly chalky and artificial. The processing compensates for low-quality raw milk because the farms themselves aren't producing anything worth celebrating. Some operations even rely on feed additives to manage the challenges of keeping cows confined indoors year-round. None of this information appears anywhere on the packaging, and it doesn't fundamentally change the milk you're drinking, but it demonstrates how completely industrial priorities have taken over from anything resembling natural farming practices. Every time you pour basics, remember, you're not just choosing cheap milk, you're buying into a system built on scale, shortcuts, and compromises that happened long before the carton reached the shelf. From concrete barns through processing facilities across distribution networks into your kitchen, most of the natural character disappeared somewhere along the way. When it separates in your tea or tastes oddly thin, it's not your fault or a problem with your kettle. That's just what this milk actually is. Simple and cheap isn't always harmless. Some compromises show up the moment you pour it. Simply Fresh sounds reassuring. The label suggests something straightforward and reliable, easy on your wallet without sacrificing quality. Except there's nothing particularly simple or fresh about where this milk comes from, or what happens before it reaches that bottle. Massive industrial networks across Britain and sometimes beyond supply Lidl's dairy section, pooling milk from dozens of different farms into enormous batches. Once it's all mixed together, any connection to individual cows or specific farms vanishes completely. You'll never know what they ate, how they lived, or what standards their farm followed. The milk loses its identity and origin story and turns into just another homogeneous white liquid. If shoppers saw how these cows actually live, they'd be shocked. Most of the time, they're stuck indoors, eating grain-heavy diets meant to push out as much milk as possible. They spend their days striking targets rather than grazing or taking in the scenery. And it shows in the milk. It's thinner, milder, and missing that natural richness you get when cows actually eat grass and live like cows instead of being treated like production machines. Maintaining consistency across these massive batches requires serious processing intervention. Strong homogenization and high heat treatment standardize everything, masking differences between sources while simultaneously stressing proteins and eliminating subtle flavors. The creaminess most people associate with good milk gets reduced to something that machines create rather than nature providing. And while every bottle looks identical, most of the character and complexity has been engineered right out. Feed additives sometimes enter the equation too, helping manage the various challenges that come with intensive indoor farming. These won't show up on your carton, and they don't improve what you're drinking, but they reveal plenty about how industrial priorities shape every aspect of modern dairy production. Simply Fresh markets itself as a straightforward everyday choice, but the reality involves scale, machinery, and shortcuts rather than cows grazing peacefully in fields. From indoor facilities to mixing tanks across borders, and through distribution systems, the milk loses most of its natural identity before reaching your refrigerator. Ever notice it tastes milder or thinner compared to a farm shop milk? That's not your imagination. That's the inevitable result of the system behind it. Fresh in name only. Sometimes the story behind a bottle tells you more than the label ever could. Aldi's budget milk looks incredibly appealing at checkout, especially when you're trying to stretch your grocery budget. That rock-bottom price feels like smart shopping until you consider what actually goes into making milk that cheap and what gets sacrificed along the way. Networks spanning Britain and Europe supply this range, combining milk from countless different farms long before bottling begins. Once mixed, there's absolutely no way to trace where it came from, or verify how those cows lived, what they ate, or what conditions existed on each individual farm. Every cow's story dissolves into a system prioritizing efficiency and uniformity over transparency or quality. The animals producing this milk rarely experience anything resembling natural life. Indoor confinement dominates, grain-heavy diets replace grass, and the entire operation focuses on maximizing production rather than animal welfare or milk quality. Without adequate grazing, the milk's inherent richness is lost, the flavors flatten, the texture gets thinner, and the delicate nuances that emerge in cows raised on pasture just vanish. What ends up in your cup still qualifies as milk technically, but it's missing the depth and complexity that nature provides when cows live normal lives. In order to help manage the stresses and issues associated with keeping thousands of cows confined indoors all year round, industrial farming also introduces interventions and additives. These don't make the milk taste better or healthier, and you won't find them mentioned on the label, but they demonstrate how far the system has moved away from anything resembling traditional dairy farming principles. When you use this milk, pouring it into tea, coffee, or over cereal, it behaves like milk superficially. It mixes, it looks fine, it doesn't curdle immediately, but there's something missing compared to higher quality alternatives. The creaminess feels muted, the taste seems flatter, texture is lighter than what you'd get from grass-fed cows living outdoors. Safe and convenient, absolutely, but compromised in ways most people don't notice until they compare it directly. Although Aldi's Everyday Essentials is reasonably priced at the register, each litre has additional expenses that aren't disclosed on the labels. Cheap milk requires cheap production methods, and those methods leave their mark on what you're drinking. From indoor farms scattered across multiple countries, through blending facilities, and into your bottle, the milk loses its individual story and most of its character. When it tastes noticeably thinner than farm shop milk, you're experiencing the direct result of choosing price over everything else. Stretching your budget is tempting, but cheap milk often carries invisible costs that your cup will quietly reveal. Morrison's budget range looks tempting when you're trying to save money, and Saver's milk seems like an easy place to cut costs without sacrificing too much. The problem is that cheap dairy requires cheap production, and those savings come at the expense of quality, flavor, and farming standards you probably care about more than you realize. Multiple farms contribute to this range, sometimes from different countries, all their milk blended together long before reaching supermarket shelves. By the time you open that carton, the identity of individual cows, their farms, and even their basic diet has been erased completely. You're drinking uniform white liquid shaped by logistics and industrial processing rather than anything resembling traditional dairy farming. The farms supplying Savers rely heavily on intensive indoor systems where cows get confined, fed grain-dominated diets, and pushed to produce maximum volume regardless of quality concerns. Minimal pasture access means the milk comes out thinner, paler, noticeably flatter than what cows grazing outdoors would produce. These animals exist to generate numbers rather than flavor, and that priority shows up in every pour. Because raw milk quality varies so dramatically between different sources, heavy processing becomes absolutely necessary. Ultra-high treatment, aggressive homogenization, and extended storage periods. All these steps stabilize the final product while simultaneously stripping away subtle flavors, stressing proteins, and removing natural creaminess. Machines and heat treatment compensate for what nature didn't provide, and while the milk might look normal, most of its original character disappeared during processing. Feed additives occasionally enter the picture too, helping farms manage various pressures that come with intensive indoor operations. These interventions don't improve the milk you're drinking and won't appear anywhere on the label. They just keep the industrial system running smoothly without addressing underlying quality issues. Morrison Savers might save money at checkout, but it doesn't preserve richness, taste, or decent farming standards. Every liter reflects the compromises built into large-scale dairy production, from indoor barns through blending tanks, across storage and transport networks. The milk loses individuality and character. Next time it tastes thinner than expected or separates in your tea, remember, that's not a defect in your cup. That's just the story behind the bottle showing through. The savings are obvious, but what's harder to see is how much of the milk's character gets lost along the way. At the absolute bottom of the pricing ladder sits Asda's Smart Price milk, usually costing less than £1 for 2 liters. Seems almost too good to be true, and honestly, it is. When milk costs this little, you need to ask what else got cut beside the price, because making dairy products this cheap requires sacrifices most shoppers never see or think about. Suppliers can shift week to week, sometimes sourcing from British farms, sometimes pulling from European operations, with traceability disappearing entirely. You can't determine which cow produced your milk, what it ate, how it lived, or what standards applied on its farm. Each liter blends together countless animals, and their individual stories vanish long before the milk reaches your refrigerator. The farms themselves prioritize production over quality or the well-being of the animals. Cows are kept indoors for the majority of their lives and fed grain-based diets that are primarily produced for output rather than for flavor or health. They're not grazing in fields or enjoying sunshine, they're generating quantity at the expense of everything else. The milk reflects these priorities immediately. Thinner consistency, paler color, lacking the natural richness that develops when cows actually eat grass and live normal lives. Making these mixed batches look consistent and last on shelves requires aggressive processing intervention. Ultra-high heat treatment, strong homogenization, stabilization techniques. All these steps stress proteins and mute natural flavors in exchange for uniformity and extended shelf life. In hot drinks, the milk can separate or taste flat, sometimes even slightly artificial. Machines handle the work that nature should, creating products that look uniform while eliminating most of the original character. Some farms also use feed additives to manage the various pressures and problems that come with intensive indoor operations. These won't show up on your label, and they don't improve what you're drinking, but they signal how completely industrial priorities have overtaken traditional farming principles. Smart Price pours just like milk, costs almost nothing, and offers maximum convenience. But every liter carries the story of shifting suppliers, heavy processing, and hidden compromises that make that low price possible. From blending tanks through long transport routes, what arrives in your bottle has lost most of its individuality and character. Ever notice it tastes slightly off in tea or coffee compared to better milk? That's not a mistake in your cup. That's the inevitable result of choosing the absolute cheapest option available. Not all milk is what it seems. And now you know the truth behind some of the worst UK brands on the shelves. If you want more honest takes on everyday products and what's really inside them, hit that subscribe button.